My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I cannot choose the colors. He weaveth steadily. Ofttimes he weaveth sorrow, and I, in foolish pride, forget he sees the upper, and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent and shuttles cease to fly will God unroll the canvas and reveal the reasons why. The dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned. He knows, he loves, he cares. Nothing this truth can dim. He gives the very best to those who leave the choice to him. Corrie ten Boom knew something of the dark threads of the weaver's canvas. We've been walking through this story of Saul and David. Saul's been sowing, apparently, some dark threads in David's life, has he not? Must leave a mark on somebody to see a spear stick into the wall right next to their head 3 times. To have a spear thrown at their best friend on their behalf. Dark threads. It's easy to ask in exasperation, why doesn't God just take Saul out? Why not? We know that we serve a God of mercy and of justice. Why not have a justice moment, God? But I would suggest that God is using Saul to ensure that David does not become Saul. And there's more of that in our text this morning. Please meet me in your copy of God's Word in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. If memory serves me correctly, you can find that on those in those black Bibles underneath the chair in front of you on either page 230 or 231. I forgot to write it down. Is it 230? Oh, haha. 231? Oh, shoot. Nah, I should have. I was about to gloat. I got you within a page. 1 Samuel chapter 24. I'm going to read the first 4 verses and then we'll walk through the text together. A little bit of a different format this morning. I know typically when we preach through Old Testament narrative, I kind of preach through the story and then we have one big takeaway at the end. We're going to build the takeaway one line at a time through the message this morning. Just a little bit different. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in the front at the in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave. A little embarrassing here for Saul. And Saul went in to relieve himself. Now, David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you." Then David arose and stealthily cut off the corner of Saul's robe. I'd like to title my message this morning, God Doesn't Cut Corners. Now, we've seen that, right? I mean, he's taken the long way around with David. And I can tell, man, you're a bright, shiny bunch. I'm sure God's never taken you the long way around on anything, right? But you can go there at least hypothetically with me in your imagination, right? Just imagine that there was a time where you were up against something and crying out either out loud or in your heart, God, why is this taking so long? I heard a preacher say one time, it is not the depth of the valley that gets you. It's not the darkness of the valley that gets you. It's the duration in the valley that gets you. Why take you through the valley? Because he doesn't cut corners. Look with me again at verse 1. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. And so Saul has been, he got called away from his chase of David last week to go pursue the Philistines, and now he's like back on the hunt again. Verse 2, then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel. You think he took like the guys off the bottom of the roster? How about the middle? He took the best. Out of all Israel, and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. If any of you are thinking of like opening a bar and grill in Caldwell at some point, you should totally steal that, by the way. Just saying, sometimes the creative work's done for you, you know? The chase is back on, verse 3. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave. Saul went in to relieve himself. You might see in your footnote there, it literally means cover his feet. That word cover his feet means his robe would have been covering his feet. It's literal. And he had no idea about the second half of verse 3. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. There's about 600 guys with David at this point. So it's not a small cave. Must have been a big cave. Verse 4. And the men of David said to him, here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. So, here's a conundrum. That quote from the Lord, and they use the covenant name of God. That's what those capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D means. Yahweh. Here's what remember when Yahweh said this to you, David? Here's the problem. It's not in the book. It's possible that God said that to David, they knew about it, and Samuel decided not to write it down. That's possible. But I really wonder if Samuel's trying to show us something by the fact he didn't write it down. I don't know if you remember or not from back in 1 Samuel chapter 15, but one of the primary accusations of God against Saul was that he was presumptuous. he was presumptuous. And I think there's a temptation here for David to be presumptuous. How easy it would have been. I mean, there's a military term. We caught them with their pants around their ankles. And that's literally what's going on right here. There is nothing that would stop David from going and slitting Saul's throat. The problem is, we've got no record of God ever saying to David, when you see the opportunity, take it. That's not in there. The second half of verse 4 that says, then David arose stealthily and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. That's a big diss. Cutting off Saul's robe is a big diss. Now, maybe it's not as big of a diss as cutting his throat. But we don't really have, like, I don't get up here and preach in a robe. This robe would have been a symbol of Saul's authority. And we don't really have too many symbols of authority. Probably the closest symbol of authority that we would have would be this right here. Don't unmute it. I'm just using it as a prop. This in our society is a symbol of authority. People generally don't get these unless they're in charge. Have you noticed that? Somebody gets up and hits a microphone and goes, hello, you know. Everybody goes, right? Because we're a little bit of a media-driven society. Everybody understand that? So just imagine that somebody in authority is standing up here doing their authority thing, and somebody else walks up and cuts the cord while they're talking. Ooh, that's not good. It's still a diss, but he does spare his life. What I want to focus in on here for just a moment is that in verse 4, David gets some advice that sounds really godly, but might not be. And I say might because we don't really know. It's very possible that God did say this to him. It's just not recorded. But I can't ignore the fact that Samuel ignored recording it. I can't ignore the fact that it's not recorded earlier than this. Why is it coming up now? Why is this coming up now? And so the first thing I want to show you from this text is that self-centered preservation can sound godly. Self-centered preservation can sound godly. I got to tell you, it is one of the most innate human responses is to preserve yourself. At what cost? All costs. And when you are focused on you, when I am focused on me, that self-centered preservation mechanism takes nothing to kick in. It's just like, how many of you, that is more than one step out of reach for you at any given moment? Same here. I don't even have to look. Boom, self-preservation. I got hold of it right now. You hear all kinds of things like this when it comes to, and I'm not saying that there aren't truth. It's like sometimes these statements are true, sometimes these statements are helpful, but I hear them used all the time in a way that points to self-preservation. Man, I just got to get all these toxic people out of my life. Now, is there some wisdom in not taking in the counsel of fools? Yes, there is. Yes, there is. But so often when I hear that phrase used, it's not used like that. It's used like, man, all this is hurting me, and my self-preservation mechanism is going to kick in right now, and I'm kicking all these people out of my life. Self-centered preservation can sound godly. You can make it sound like it's what God wants you to do. But that doesn't mean it is what God wants you to do. Self-centered preservation can sound godly. It's so hard for me when somebody levels an accusation against me not to defend myself. To ready, fire, aim. And I promise I can even make it sound godly. Can you? Self-centered preservation can sound godly. Let's keep going. Verse 5. And afterward, David's heart struck him. David feels convicted. Why? Keeps going. Because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Because he went with a box cutter to the microphone cord. Mired the symbol of his authority. And he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord." And you see, that's all lowercase, my Lord, because he's talking about his master, Saul. He's saying, that guy's still my master. Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, Yahweh's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing that he is the Lord's anointed. So, David, what's the next word? What is it? David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. So there's some kind of indication. I don't know if David's kind of reading between the lines or if some of them said, well, if you're not going to do it, I'll do it. He did not permit them to attack Saul, and Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. So Saul does his business and walks out of the cave none the wiser. He doesn't even know that they were in there. That word persuaded means that the guys that were with David weren't convinced he was doing the right thing. Do you see where I'm getting that in the text? That what David said moved their hearts away from what they wanted David to do. And my guess is this looked reckless to those guys. I mean, here he is, the guy who keeps trying to literally pin you to the wall. And you literally caught him with his pants around his ankles. And now is your chance to put a stop to this. Would Israel benefit from David being king instead of Saul right now, you think? Just watch all the ways that I could justify cutting Saul's throat right now. Can anybody think of some ways that we could justify David's actions here? Can anybody think of how, if you're following David and you're hiding in a cave and it happens to be the cave that everybody takes a dump in, that you'd be like, you're foolish not to take action right now. That's because while self-centered preservation can sound godly, here's the next thing. godly mercy can look reckless. Self-centered preservation can sound godly. And godly mercy can look reckless. Mercy is not giving someone what they deserve. Saul deserves to die for what he has done. David could argue, even in some ways, in our defense system today, about self-defense here. But David doesn't give him what he deserves. David feels bad about cutting Saul's robe. All this, it reminds me of another robe cutting, tearing moment earlier in the book. You don't have to turn there. You can if you want to 1 Samuel chapter 15. But Saul has just gotten caught disobeying God. Like, not misinterpreting God, not misunderstanding, disobeying. Like, God gave him a word, a command from a prophet through the prophet's mouth, and Saul didn't do it. And he tried to make his disobedience sound holy, by the way. He tried to make his disobedience sound godly, and he confesses. He's like, oh, I get it now. Once he's confronted, he's like, oh, I get it now. And then he's like, okay, how are we going to make this look better? Is kind of the play he runs. Verse 25 of 1 Samuel chapter 15 says, now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may bow before the Lord. He wants Samuel to put a stamp of approval, like, hey, it's all good. Like, I'm coming back with Saul and he's worshiping now. Everything's okay. Samuel goes, verse 26, and Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you. For you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. As Samuel turned to go away, Saul seized the skirt of his robe. Saul seized, can't you see him? Clamoring for self-preservation. This is self-centered preservation. No, you got to make me look good. Saul seized the skirt of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from this day and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. So, to extend our microphone illustration a little bit further, just imagine I'm up here saying some things, blah, 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 doing my thing, right? And then Way comes up at the end of the service and goes, I have to correct some things that Pastor Phil said today. And so I run up to the booth and mute Way. And then Way snaps around and goes, God is going to mute you. That's what just happened in that passage. And I really believe that Saul is being used by the Lord to make sure that David doesn't become Saul. And so I think it's possible. The text doesn't say, I think it's possible. Everybody say it's possible. It's possible that David sees this corner of this robe in his hand and goes, oh boy. I can't become like this guy in order to take him out. And he has the exact opposite reaction to Saul, who showed no remorse about tearing a prophet's robe. Here, David's heart is struck by this fact that he has dared to cut the robe of the Lord's anointed. David is proving that he's not like Saul. And so self-centered preservation, it can sound godly. And godly mercy can look reckless. And maybe you've seen something like this in your own life, where you've seen somebody extend mercy to somebody else. And you've been like, I'm not so sure that's a great idea. That looks a little bit reckless. Sometimes godly mercy can look reckless. Verse 9 of, where am I? 24. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 9. Oh, excuse me, verse 8. And afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. There had to be at least one guy behind David who's like, don't go at that. You know? Like, don't go. Can we go further back? Like, can we hide in the cave further? And here David puts his neck on the line. Verse 9. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father." That's huge, because David is Saul's son-in-law. "See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand? For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it." I'm not like David. He says, "Some told me to kill you." I'm telling you, if I was David, I'd have had that idea all on my own. See, David's not listening to all the people around him about this. But Saul is. That's why David asks in verse 9, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks you harm'?" I got to tell you, I'm not like Saul either. I don't need anybody to put that idea in my head. If somebody comes at me a little bit sideways, I don't have anybody to say, "Hey, I think that person's trying to hit you." I have that idea all on my own. And I know I'm not the only one. And I can make the self-centered preservation sound godly, and I can make the godly mercy look reckless. And I can choose to preserve myself. What's David going to do? Where's he going to put his confidence here? Verse 12. "May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. He's saying, it doesn't matter, Saul, it doesn't matter how many times you come at me, I'm not coming at you. And he doesn't say that because he's trying to make himself look better than Saul. He says that because he trusts the Lord to be the judge. He trusts the Lord to be the judge more than he trusts Saul to be the judge. And get this, he trusts the Lord to be judge more than he trusts himself to be judge. I'm going to say that one more time because I really believe that the Lord brought someone here today because they needed to hear that. He trusts the Lord to be judge more than he trusts himself to be judge. I saw a quote online this week. It was so good. It was so helpful for me. And it was, don't believe everything you think. Because we all hear all the time, don't believe everything you hear. Man, sometimes I got to not believe what I think. Sometimes I got to believe what God says more than I believe what I think. David is putting it all on the Lord right here. Verse 14. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? Like, what am I to you? Is what David's asking. Verse 15, he says it again. May the Lord therefore judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. I don't have to. You understand the freedom that David experiences in that moment where he's like, I don't have to deliver me out of your hand because God will do it. I don't have to wield my sword in such a way that I carve out my own deliverance. God has it covered. This is the last line in our big idea that we're building out as we walk through the text here. Self-centered preservation can sound godly, and godly mercy can look reckless. But God judges perfectly. Be slow to say, well, that person's just preserving themselves. Be slow to say, oh, that person's reckless. Be slow. Let God make the judgment. You'll find freedom in it. Do you know that there's actually not freedom in you being in control? There's freedom in God being in control. Self-centered preservation can look godly. Godly mercy can look reckless, but God judges perfectly. Look with me at verse 16. As soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. This hit home. Saul's a little bit the self-preservation guy. And I think he's, in this moment, pretty thankful his self was preserved. Verse 17, he said to David, here it comes, the truth out of someone who lies. He said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. That's the first echo, by the way, of what David's men said to him earlier. It's coming out of Saul's mouth. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. That's so significant in verse 19, because what Saul is realizing is even though Saul viewed him and David as enemies of one another, he's saying, well, if I was your enemy, you wouldn't have let me go. He's calling out what he sees in David's perspective. And now, behold, I know that you shall surely be king. Now, he says he knows it. It doesn't say he likes it. But that's a huge admission from Saul. First time we've seen him admit it. Only took him 9 chapters. And the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Why is he saying all that? Self-preservation. Verse 21. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. So there is a sense, it almost feels like he's repenting a little bit, but also he wants to make sure, you're not going to take my name off the plaque, are you? Right? Still some self-preservation. And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. And I want to read the first verse of chapter 25 as part of our message today. Now, Samuel died. And all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. This is the most significant reconciliation you will see between David and Saul. There's going to be another like it coming up, but this is the most significant one. And this isn't necessarily part of the main thrust here, I don't think, but it just really, really struck me. God's got his timing on this. God's got his timing. Not Saul's timing, not David's timing, not even Samuel's timing, but his own timing on this. Self-centered preservation can sound godly. Godly mercy can look reckless. But the Lord judges perfectly. The question is, do you actually trust him to get the judgment right? Do you trust him enough to get the judgment right, to not hit send? Do you trust him to get the judgment right enough to not hit post? God help us. Do you trust him to get the judgment right? To not use that accusation to cut that person down when you know they are in your hand to do what you will. Sometimes I tell people, I learned to be married in an early first-year argument where I knew the conversation had turned in such a way that with one sentence, I could undo her. And then I didn't do it. And there has been one of those moments for me for every 5 times there have been for her. I'm a much more easier person to accuse of things than my wife is. And she's so merciful to me. She's merciful to me in a way that for people looking in on our relationship might even look a little bit reckless. And I think it's godly. Not only do I think it's godly, I think it's cross-shaped. You want to talk about reckless-looking mercy. Look no further than the gospel. The gospel is the good news that while we were still sinners, I just want to remind you, Saul has not done to David as much as you have done to Jesus. Not even close. And while we were still sinners, while we were still broken, Jesus was born, died on the cross, he rose from the dead, he went to heaven, and he is coming back again. Amen. And I'll tell you what, there are so many people who look at that and go, that's just reckless. Hanging on a cross for people who don't even know they need you yet. Hanging on a cross for my sin. And he did not choose the self-preservation route. At one point he prayed, if there's another way, can we do that? Nevertheless, not my will, Father, but yours be done. In the Gospels, it's recorded that he could have called down a multitude of angels like that to rescue him off of that cross. But he didn't choose self-centered preservation. He chose mercy that looked reckless. And when we extend that same mercy to one another, and yes, to the people who intentionally wish us harm, it's gospel-shaped ministry.